Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing well.
Good. Excellent.
And we're going to do what we usually try to do every day, and that is inform people to the best of our knowledge and try to explain what's going on. And the dominant issue in the news for 3 or 4 months now has been coronavirus, even though I think that's artificial. They pushed it up there to being number one on the list, where I think big government is the problem. Of course, coronavirus has made the government even bigger. But you know, the financial aspects of what's going on and the stock market breaking down and the bursting of the bubble, these are all very, very important. But the one thing that we have talked about is not every country did the same thing. And we've been critical of our policies in the United States. And some states, though, within the United States have done it differently, and they did better than the other states. And I guess the bigger the states are, the more progressive they are. They know what is progressive. The worse the conditions have been, and I'm thinking now of California and New York and a few other places, and thinking about some of the western states that just said we don't need all that. There's no economic and scientific reasons for us to do this. But Sweden keeps popping up in the news, fortunately, and we encourage it because the Swedes have taken a different position. They have this one old-fashioned idea that you're supposed to pay attention to the science of things, and they've paid attention to it, and they know a little bit about herd immunity, and they followed it, and they endorsed the things where they thought were scientifically proven, and that is some quarantining and some cautions and some medications and allowing people to take medications that they want, and but not to close down the economy. They followed that, but we've come across a chart which is pretty dramatic. We can talk and say things, but when we put this chart up, I want people to keep looking at it, and sometimes I think it's a good idea looking at them again if we think of it later on, because it's so dramatic of the difference between our activism by the progressives and the anti-science people. They're so dramatic that they make a point, and I think that I'm sure you'll have a few words to say about that.
Yeah, I know these lockdowns have been, I think, the greatest attack on our civil liberties maybe in the history of the world. What's happened. But Sweden, you're right, did do it differently. And let's look at a couple of charts from Sweden. Here's the first one. They basically have no deaths anymore in Sweden, and they didn't lock down. They had some voluntary restrictions of movement, which everyone does. You remember, Dr. Paul, in the old days when we used to have the normal flu, you see on the TV, big flu outbreak, everyone pay attention, and some people might stay home, some people would, do other things. But here's the chart you were talking about, and this is the next one. If everything they say about lockdowns and shutdowns is correct, this next chart should not be happening. Let's take a look at it. These are rolling 7-day averages of COVID deaths between the U.S. and Sweden. The United States, which more or less locked down, restricted its people, destroyed its economy. If that were the case, to prevent against this, Sweden should be on top and the U.S. should be down there with almost no deaths, when in fact that is not happening. This is the one chart, I think, above anything else that disproves the idea of lockdowns being a wise course to follow in an outbreak.
Right, and I believe what they have done, and nothing is perfect, but I think this is a result of giving us the right information. Now, did the United States and these other countries have the information? Well, they did, but they were working from a different basis. They started fudging the numbers. The data was unreliable. And the other thing that the Swiss emphasized and mentions is that they count the deaths of the actual day of death. And you've emphasized that in our conversation, that it's when they die. But if you had all of July reported on August 1st, oh my Lord, look at what's happening. The world's falling apart. So it was just being more scientific is what they wanted to do. And all of a sudden something different comes out. But it certainly made a difference because they didn't have the same agenda. And that means we're trying to interpret the people's motives, which is not easy to do, because some people that went along with all this and still do, because I meet them all the time, I don't want my kids to get this. This is deadly, and they're just terribly frightened. Less now than it used to be, but this is what they're worried about is how deadly this is. But it seems like there was not any true reassurance. It was always scaremongering. When are we going to get the virus? When are we going to get the lockdown? When are we ever going to let the kids out of the house again? When are we allowed to ever shake hands again? No, you'll never shake hands again.
Fauci.
So this sort of thing goes on. But why? We ask it all the time. And of course, we've posed a couple theories on that. There are motives because it's combined with other events like the economic downturn from the bubble that the Federal Reserve created. And it's also mixed in with demonstrators. We have demonstrators wanting to deal with pro and con on masks being used. At the same time, there are demonstrators out there because they're part of the Black Lives Movement. And then you mix it in with some violence, and all of a sudden motives become very, very important. It just may be that the Swedes were interested in the motive of just presenting the facts, just the facts.
And I don't know about you, Dr. But for me, it feels like we're hitting our head against the wall every time we come to talk about this. It literally feels like it. But the whole idea of a one-size-fits-all approach to this, doing something that's never been done before, which is locking down healthy people, locking down children, and denying the concept of herd immunity, which has been with us since we were in herds, running and hunting and gathering, but just beating our head against the wall saying, why isn't anyone talking about the possibility that the entire approach was wrong? That's never even allowed to be put on the table. And, Fauci was before Congress a couple of weeks ago when there was the Sun Belt surge, and he said the resurgence in the U.S. came because we didn't lock down early enough and lock down hard enough. The Europeans did it right. Look how great they're doing. They locked down and they did it right and they have no problems. Well, guess what? Shortly after he said that, there's a surge in Europe now. There's a surge in Germany and Spain, all the lockdown countries in Europe. So normal people like us, I hope we're kind of normal, would conclude that, hey, maybe the lockdown didn't prevent the spreading of the disease, but simply delayed the inevitable, that the virus would spread through society, and it prolonged the agony in so doing because of this destruction of commerce, destruction of lives, depression, alcoholism, etc. What if they were wrong in their whole concept?
Well, the Swedes talked about concepts, and one was herd immunity. They argued the case that they were operating from a scientific viewpoint, and I think that we've talked a lot about herd immunity, and there's a lot of catching up to do when the interventionist puts a lot of monkey wrenches in there, and that's what you were talking about. They do this and change the rules and changes nature, but it doesn't change events. And then you get involved with, let's try this, but don't use the drug that might work, on all this stuff. And then you get the FDA involved. And I think I think the term that needs to be used more often now is herd immunity deniers.
Yeah.
They're out there, they literally are denying. If they believed in it, they wouldn't have done all these dumb things. But the Swiss emphasized this. The Swedes, they emphasized this and said there is such a thing as herd immunity, and they let the course run. And now they're better off. And, of course, that led them to say, if things aren't quite like the people in the West are saying, maybe we don't need to lock down. And all of a sudden they came to a better economic conclusion. And just think of the difference between us trying to recover from the lockdown, the economic problems we have, and compared to the Swedes.
And why hasn't a single journalist that I've heard, and maybe we didn't hear him, why hasn't a single journalist raised their hand and said, Dr. Fauci, Just wondering, what are your comments on Sweden? They seem to have gotten through this pretty well with their economy intact, and they never locked down. Do you ever consider the fact that your approach might be wrong and your whole concept is wrong? Why isn't, we have a free press here, we have journalists who are out there, why won't they even ask this basic question?
Well, I think possibly the media is in on the deal.
Yeah.
Maybe they're in on the planning when all this was going on. This is why we can take a probably pretty close to an average flu season and turn it into a monster. We've seen the statistics showing where the influenza virus has killed a lot of people, and in some years more. And at this time, now they're starting to point out the detriment of the interference and the denial of hydroxychloroquine, that they end up with more tuberculosis. But it's all the interference causes more problems, and you need to do 2 new things to correct the problems they made.
Always the case, isn't it? Always the case. And people say, well, this is a really bad year then if it's a regular flu year. But you would have to subtract the fake cases, because I don't know that ever before they've lumped in everyone and called it the seasonal flu. If you were 89 years old and had a heart attack 3 days ago and you somehow died and you had the flu, that it was a flu. So you take all of that out, I bet you would probably cut it in half. And in fact, we've talked on this show about so many anecdotal pieces of evidence of counts being massively overdone. I think you were just looking at one in Florida, weren't you?
Yeah, and this was reported, it was in Palm Beach County down there, and they had been listing them, and the report, that everybody knows about, there were 658 deaths. And somebody went back there and had the audacity of double-checking thing. And their analysis from a pathological viewpoint that wanted to check out, and they only found 86 of them where you could say a healthy person got the disease and died. And even in the article they listed quite a few where they would go in, a lot were in the nursing homes, at 80 and 90 years old, and they had diabetes and they had complications. So it turns out that there were only 86 out of 658 that really should say, well, you better wake up, this is a serious disease. It means you can't ignore the fact that it's very serious, but you can't ignore the fact that the doctors that I look at right now and understand who would use the chloroquine, they're not allowed to. The FDA sort of banned it.
Yeah.
And you have to get special rules and regulations, and it doesn't do any good. And yet it has a history of 65 years. And a lot of doctors think that in a libertarian society it would be on the shelf. You do it if an individual figured this out, because governments can't protect us against ourselves for making these choices, and it's hard protecting ourselves against the choices that the government makes. That's where the biggest problem is.
Well, death is the one thing that we all have in common, that we share, that we will all eventually die, and it's a very difficult concept, and people are rightly terrified of it. But one of the more unpleasant but aspects of this that I think we need to talk about is in Sweden, for example. We've said before that Sweden did not do well in the nursing homes. There was a lot of older folks died in Sweden. But in fact, the average age of Sweden's nursing home deaths was 82 years old. And the actual average lifespan of a Swede is 82 years old. So the people that died were of the age, on average, that Swedes die. And that essentially, and this has happened in other places too, they say that the deaths that we've had among older folks were really just deaths that were front-loaded in the year. They most likely would have passed away in the course of that year anyway. It doesn't make it any less tragic for the families that are dealing with the loss of a loved one, but put into perspective that these people were very elderly and very ill in the first place, it should at least inform our decisions about it.
Yes, and long term we have consequences too. We've talked about the younger generation that is having trouble adjusting to this lockdown and not going to school, and they don't understand it, and they get very frightened. But there are some long longer term things. We can look at the immediate problems and the difficulties. Well, just think of the businesses that have closed down. They'll never open up again.
Yeah.
But this mentality is, and it's sort of a bipartisan mentality, just print more money. Just send them some money. Let them pay their bills, and everything will be okay. And the two parties support that principle. They argue over who gets the money first, who gets the most money. So they go on and on. But there are projections now that are looking out a little bit further on, and there was one article, global lockdowns set to plunge 100 million people into extreme poverty.
Wow.
I believe that is the case because the challenge is not only the virus and the lockdown, that is a big deal, but we have the threat of the growing menace of cultural and economic Marxism in this country, and people are rolling over for it. When you see the mayors and local officials actually being part of the mob that's burning down the cities, at the same time it's a monetary issue too, and nobody even talks about that. So the spending goes on, and so that does not produce prosperity. It doesn't get these people back to work. When things get way out of whack in economics, what they have to do is get rid of the mistakes. If something is hurting, or if we're sick, we have to finally get over the illness or what. But for right now, we're just adding to the illness. And these projections, should wake up people. But they say, well, the stock market looks like it's doing real good. It's gigantic. Everybody's happy, and not everybody, but the people who write the news.
They're happy.
They're happy, and the people whose design was to keep the stock market very high, they're happy. But long term, you have to get rid of the bad investments. You have to get rid of the debt. You have to free up the economy and let people take care of their own illnesses and let people take care of their own finances and get them out of the way. And then you go back to having economic growth again. But we're nowhere close to that. We're making this worse. So who knows? 100 million, 50 million, 200 million. And that's been my argument. You've heard it, that we've lived beyond our means for a long, long time, and we will be forced to live beneath our means, and it's going to last as long as we don't do the right thing in releasing the creative energy that comes from a free society. That's what I'm working on. Next week we'll have that.
We'll have that settled out. But 100 million people, this is a new study out by the World Bank, I think, and the Pulitzer Center did some reporting on it. 100 million people plunged into extreme poverty, less than $2 a day to survive on. And of course the report, being written by a relatively mainstream organization, blames the coronavirus, but in reality it's the lockdowns that have destroyed the economies. And here's actually a chart. This next picture we have, Dr. Paul, is so stark. It shows you, if you see that one line going downward, that is where extreme poverty was diminishing from 2015. They were getting a very good handle on reducing extreme poverty. And then you see when COVID and the lockdowns hit, you see those projections of it just massively increasing, going back years of progress toward helping people live a little bit better. It's just incredible to see, not the virus, but the reaction to the virus. And it would be even worse if what's even worse is it doesn't work. In New Zealand, as an example, it's in the news today. The Prime Minister of New Zealand is putting Auckland, the largest city, back on lockdown because 4 people, and they're all members of one family, 4 people, the first 4 people in 102 days tested positive for the disease. Why does this show that lockdown doesn't work? Well, because it's an island in the Pacific Ocean. They have quarantine of visitors. They're quarantined. The transmission cycle for the COVID is 5 days. They have not had a single positive for 102 days. So if you do the math, you figure out closing this island off for 102 days, how do you get 4 new cases out of the blue if you're blocking everyone anyway? And as Alex Berenson says in Twitter, and I encourage people to follow his account, he says that they're all wrong with the lockdowns. It doesn't work. His phrase is virus gonna virus. And it's a simple phrase, but it just captures the reality that this is how viruses behave.
One rule they ought to try to remember is when you increase government power to solve a problem that the government created, what they're doing is they're diminishing liberty even more. Almost everything that the government does is a diminishing of liberty if the government is unless the government is designed to protect your liberty. But it isn't. It's there to make us safe and sound and free and prosperous by force and to police the world. But every time you decrease the amount of activity by the government and release the people to take care of themselves, whether it's their health needs, whether it's their spiritual needs, whether it's their economic needs, everything gets better. There will always be people in need, but the question then is, if you're dealing with 1 or 2 or 3% of the people who are in need, do you say, well, we're going to sacrifice the liberties of the rest because they have too much, and it's on and on, the redistribution of wealth and control and power, and then all it is fighting over who gets the power, and that's what we're in the middle of, but also we're running out of the wealth. The wealth is shrinking rapidly, and that's what this 100 million people of poverty is coming. It's not going to, they'll be in the poor nations worse than anything, but there's going to be a lot of people here, in this country right now. Even in the last 5-6 months, a lot of people paid their rent because they were sent checks. And now, of course, there was just a ruling, Trump's executive order, we're going to continue, maybe not quite as much, but try to, keep that going. People say, isn't that good? And, well, in the narrow sense, it's good because you're giving them a fix and they're going to feel better, but it doesn't solve the problem. And all we look to is more government action, more government spending, no concern for liberty, no concern for where wealth comes from, and conditions continue to deteriorate.
Well, I'm going to close out if we're getting there, but I do want to, before I close, I just want to remind everyone, let's put up this next graphic, I want to remind everyone that our good friend Tom Woods is offering $160 in incentives to get involved with the Ron Paul homeschool curriculum. ronpaulhomeschool.com. Go through Tom Woods. It's a difficult time for parents. Schools aren't reopening. Teachers want to sit home in their pajamas and still get paid. Parents need a way that their children can learn, and they still have their lives they've got to get on with. It's a self-taught K through 12 curriculum. We use it at our house. It's very useful. Go to ronpaulhomeschool.com and check out what Tom Woods can do for you. And my final word is Susan Rice. The odds makers are saying she is going to be picked by Biden to be our vice president. She's the next person. Of course, no one is really expecting Biden to be a president for very long. If what is apparent to us is true, that he's not in the best of health. So Susan Rice may well rise to the presidency. I was on a show earlier today about Susan Rice, and what's really interesting, I came across an article in The Atlantic of just a couple of days ago. She was interviewed just before the inauguration in 2017, and they said, Ms. Rice, what is it that keeps you up at night? And she said, a pandemic that's gone out of control. And if that isn't spooky, she went on to say later in the presidency, actually just a couple of weeks ago, she said, President Trump botched it. We set up an office to handle pandemics in the Obama administration, and he disbanded it. So all these deaths are his fault. It really does make you wonder, because Susan Rice was a key figure in Russiagate. She was involved in the unmasking of Trump campaign officials that were being spied on by the NSA for no reason whatsoever. Is something, not to deny the virus, but is somehow cooking this into a political pie beyond someone like Susan Rice? No way. This is her stock in trade. She's an evil person. She will make Dick Cheney look like a puppy dog.
I didn't plan to talk about my particular evil person. You might put him into that category because I'm going to mention a name that you've mentioned before, and that's Scott Gottlieb, former chairman or a board member of the FDA. And he's giving advice. And I was kidding Daniel today. I said, I guess we got to take his advice. He says, I'd advise you not to take that Russian vaccine. It's dangerous to it. He's probably right about that. But does that make it so that the Gates vaccines or the Fauci advice on vaccines is all of a sudden going to work? And I imagine Gottlieb still has his fingers into the drug business as well. But when I first started thinking seriously about the FDA was when I got out of medical school and started prescribing drugs and things. And it was always FDA approval, FDA approval. And that sort of gave you a little bit of confidence. They do a lot of testing and this. Then as years went on, I kept thinking, I've heard they just kept this drug off for 15 years longer than it should have been. And it's a good drug and it would have saved umpteen thousands of lives. And I thought, well, they're just inept and slow and bureaucratic. And then the next time I read something about the FDA, they authorized the use of this and they didn't do this, and it was a killer. It did a lot of damaging. So over the years, to tell you the truth, I lost just about all confidence of the FDA and people like Gottlieb and Fauci and Gates. And this is the whole thing. Now I think about the FDA and these things a little bit differently. It used to be they're just people wanting to do what the right thing is, and they're sacrificing their financial career and coming and taking a government salary, and they just are inept because they don't know how inept the bureaucracies are. But now it looks like it's much bigger than this. I wouldn't ever dare use the word conspiracy because I don't know who conspires with whom. But I tell you what, when people get together and they orchestrate, and it ends up in the media, it ends up in the government, it ends up in the Congress, and it ends up in this whole combination of corporatism, the big corporations and the drug companies having the influence with the FDA, very suspicious. And this is the reason why people should be suspicious of it and realize that the failure of this type of system, because it's more incestuous than ever before, the combination of big business and big government. And we have a lot of economic problems, and it just has fallen into the laps of these principled Marxists, because they say, see all this free enterprise, it's failing. It isn't this crony capitalism and inflationism and Federal Reserve. That's not failing. It's free markets that's failing. So they use that, and look how it's caused the maldistribution of wealth. The wealthy get wealthier and the poor get poorer, and on and on. So there's a perfect excuse for the far left. I believe that's one of the most important things we do as libertarians and conservatives is work on this issue to get away from accepting the blame for this. And unfortunately, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they're all quite willing, not to distinguish it and defend the marketplace and personal liberty. But it's a mess, and I'll tell you, it's going to get worse unless we continue to work on the issue of promoting the whole concept of liberty. That's where I think we are making progress. That's where the people are waking up. Just as we talk about coronaviruses and vaccines, a lot more people are waking up there. A lot of people, we quoted the statistic the other day, they said 45% people are very leery of taking vaccine. So it's working, and the people wake up, but as far as I'm concerned, too slowly, and government gets away with it too long. But there is a big difference, and that, of course, is the issue that we try to deal with here in this program, is to describe the difference between authoritarianism and non-intervention of people running their own lives, deciding their own medical decisions, who gets shots and who don't, and whether you believe in herd immunization or what, and what kind of religious beliefs you have and social views. It's all left to the individual in a free society. Oh no, but we have to protect the people against themselves. That's why they need the Faucis of the world to tell us all what to do. It doesn't work. It's evil. It's a destruction of the productive effort of all societies and the creativity of a free society. So we're on a conflict here because it's coming to an end, and we will have to make a decision. Are we going to just topple over and accept what's happening in our streets now, the Marxism that is marching on, or the fascism type that's infiltrated even the political parties, because they say business and government have to work together. They are partners. Baloney. They aren't partners. Partners mean that there's a use of force to benefit them. It's at the expense of somebody else. What we want is to be free. We want to get the government out of our lives, out of our pocketbooks, and allow us to take care of ourselves. And medicine would be better off for that, and that's why I advocate the separation of medicine from government. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.